The calm before the storm. The bustling city of Atlanta carried its usual rhythm on a Monday morning. People weaved in and out of traffic, trying to catch their next breath before the workweek truly set in. The streets were alive with the sound of car horns, muffled chatter, and the occasional impatient sigh of a commuter who had run out of caffeine before their third stoplight. It was the kind of city that never stopped moving, like a massive clock ticking away, its hands always pushing forward, no matter what. Jasmine Carter stepped out of her sleek black sedan with a quiet determination. Her heels clicked sharply on the pavement, a metronome marking her every step as if the world was waiting for her to set the pace. She wasn't in a rush. Her presence alone commanded attention, there was no hesitation in her movements, no second-guessing. She belonged here, in this moment, in this very space. Every inch of her was a study in grace and power, as though she had been forged for the exact moment that had arrived. The Thompson Federal Courthouse loomed before her, imposing with its gray stone facade and towering columns. It had stood for decades as the supposed beacon of justice, the place where rights were upheld, and truth was meant to prevail. But Jasmine knew better. Justice, she had learned the hard way, didn't always reside here. It was elusive, slipping through the cracks like water down a drain. And those cracks were wider than most people realized. She adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, its weight steady in her hand. It wasn't the kind of briefcase that screamed wealth, but it didn't have to. The leather was worn, soft from years of use, but it held a quiet authority. Inside, there were documents that could reshape everything, documents that could tear apart the carefully constructed walls of corruption she was about to bring to light. In her other hand, just a simple folder. But inside that folder were papers far more dangerous than anyone in the courtroom could imagine. She knew the story all too well, this wasn't just a case about an innocent woman facing false charges. This was about exposing something much larger, something far more dangerous than a few corrupt officers. This was about unraveling a system that had failed the very people it was supposed to protect. And today, Jasmine was going to show the world just how deep the rot went. The courthouse doors swung open before her, and she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and marble, mixed with the faint tang of stress and stale coffee. People walked by in a blur, some rushing, some meandering, but all absorbed in the bureaucratic dance that made up their lives. Jasmine didn't let any of it distract her. Her focus was singular. She had one mission, and it was about to unfold in this very building. As she passed through the grand lobby, she took note of the small details. How the fluorescent lights cast an unnatural glow on the white marble floor, the faded plaques on the walls that commemorated men long gone, the quiet murmur of the clerks behind the glass counters. It was a place of procedure, a place where order was supposed to reign. But Jasmine had learned the hard way that when you were fighting the system, procedure was just a weapon to be wielded against you. She continued toward the elevator, her briefcase swinging at her side. Her gaze briefly met that of Officer Marcus Ford, who was standing off to the side with his partner, Officer Lisa Harris. They didn't notice her at first, too busy exchanging glances and speaking in low tones. When Ford finally looked up and saw her, the corner of his mouth twitched upward in what was meant to be a confident smirk. He thought he had this case in the bag. He thought she would be just another statistic, just another woman they could push around. Jasmine felt the stir of anger, but she kept it in check, her expression neutral. This wasn't the time for fury. This was the time for strategy, for precision. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing they rattled her. As she walked past them, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. Ford didn't hide his disdain, his eyes narrowing as she passed. He thought she was nothing more than a victim, someone who could easily be ignored. But Jasmine had learned long ago that sometimes, the ones who are underestimated are the ones who hold the most power. She entered the courtroom and took a seat at the defense table, her briefcase resting beside her. The space around her felt colder now. She had come here to face false accusations, to challenge the story that Officer Ford and Harris had painted of her, a story of violence, of defiance, of a woman who refused to comply. But Jasmine knew that was a lie. They had twisted the truth, painted her as someone she wasn't, and now she was going to make them pay for it. The courtroom buzzed with the usual pre-trial noise, the shuffle of papers, the clink of pens against desks. But Jasmine was unfazed. She sat with the stillness of someone who knew exactly what was coming. The weight of the briefcase on the table beside her was no longer just the weight of paper, it was the weight of justice about to be served. In the documents she carried, there was power. The kind of power that could expose the lies and corruption that ran deep in the city. Officer Ford's voice drifted through the air as he spoke with his partner, oblivious to Jasmine's presence. He was confident, almost too confident. He had no idea what she had in her possession. He thought he held all the cards, but he had no idea he was playing against a hand that could destroy everything he believed he controlled. The door to the courtroom opened with a sharp creak, and the judge entered. The room fell silent as the judge made his way to the bench. He was an older man, with silver hair that matched the severity in his eyes. He was known for his no-nonsense attitude, but even he couldn't have been prepared for what was about to unfold. The bailiff called the case, and the proceedings began. Jasmine's lawyer, a woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, stood up and made her way to the podium. She gave a brief overview of the case, setting the stage for what was to come. Jasmine's heart was steady as she sat there, listening to the opening statements. She knew how this would go, the officers would lie, their story would be repeated with perfect precision, and the courtroom would buy it. But this wasn't going to be like any other case. Jasmine glanced at the clock on the wall. Time was moving quickly, but she wasn't in a hurry. She had planned this moment down to the smallest detail, and nothing was going to throw her off course. She had already decided that today wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about taking down the officers who had abused their power, about exposing the deep-seated corruption that had festered for far too long. As the prosecutor began presenting the case against her, Jasmine's thoughts began to drift, but only for a moment. She allowed herself a quick mental review of the files hidden in her briefcase. Everything was in place. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, there would be no turning back. The officers, still unaware, were preparing to speak. But in a few hours, they would learn that they had underestimated the woman in the courtroom. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for her own freedom, she was fighting for something much larger. And the tide was about to turn. In that moment, as the arguments began, Jasmine smiled quietly to herself. It wasn't the kind of smile that showed triumph. It was the kind of smile that said she knew exactly how this story would end, and it wasn't going to be in their favor. The truth was coming, and no one could stop it. The lies unfold. The courtroom was now alive with tension. The air had thickened, every word hanging in the space between the lawyers, the judge, and the gallery. Jasmine could feel it, the oppressive weight of all the eyes trained on her, the expectations, the doubts. But none of it affected her. She had weathered storms far worse than this. Today was about precision, about revealing the cracks in the facade that everyone else had missed. Officer Marcus Ford took the stand with a practiced air of authority, straightening his uniform and smoothing down the creases in his pants. His movements were deliberate, as though he was in control of everything, a man who had been through hundreds of cases like this and knew exactly how to manipulate the system to his advantage. He cast a glance around the courtroom, offering a nod to his fellow officers in the back, their eyes gleaming with that same misplaced confidence. "Your Honor," Ford began, his voice steady and sure, "on the night of the arrest, I observed Ms. Carter acting in a manner that was both aggressive and uncooperative. She was clearly agitated, making it difficult for us to maintain control of the situation. When we attempted to restrain her, she fought back violently. We had no choice but to use force in order to bring her into custody." Jasmine listened carefully, her gaze fixed on Ford, reading his every gesture, every twitch of his face. He was good, no doubt about it. He spoke with the kind of assurance that came from years of repeating the same narrative to make it sound like truth. He painted himself as a man who had been doing his job, a protector of the law, keeping order in a chaotic world. But Jasmine knew better. She had seen men like him before, and she could see through the mask. Ford continued, detailing the supposed sequence of events. He spoke with a calm that bordered on rehearsed, recounting how Jasmine had supposedly refused to follow orders, how she had allegedly tried to escape when they had approached her vehicle. But Jasmine's mind was already processing the holes in his story, the inconsistencies that lay just beneath the surface. Her lawyer, a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a keen sense of justice, stood up to cross-examine. She was unshaken, her demeanor quiet but firm as she approached the stand. The tension in the air shifted slightly, and Jasmine felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't going to be an easy win, but her lawyer knew exactly what needed to be done. "Officer Ford," her lawyer began, her voice cutting through the silence, "in your testimony, you state that Ms. Carter resisted arrest. However, you also claim that you attempted to speak with her calmly before any physical contact occurred. Can you explain why, despite this supposed calm conversation, Ms. Carter would have felt the need to resist you in the first place?" Ford's eyes flickered for just a moment, his confident expression faltering ever so slightly. "We tried to talk to her," he replied, but his voice wasn't as certain as before. "She was acting irrationally. We had to assert control over the situation." Jasmine's lawyer pressed further, her questions sharp and methodical. "And when you asserted control, Officer Ford, did you use any force before Ms. Carter made any attempt to flee? Or was she merely reacting to being approached by two officers in the middle of the night?" Ford hesitated again. The slight pause wasn't much, but it was enough. Jasmine could feel the pressure mounting on him. He had been so certain of his fabricated version of events, but now the cracks were beginning to show. "She might have been startled," Ford stammered, but quickly recovered. "But she still resisted. That's when we had to bring her down." Jasmine's lawyer shot him a pointed look, as if she could see right through him. "So, despite your claim that Ms. Carter was startled, you still felt the need to subdue her with force. You didn't think, perhaps, that a calmer approach might have been in order?" Ford's answer was a shrug, but the damage was done. Jasmine's lawyer had already laid the groundwork for reasonable doubt. The more Ford spoke, the more his story unraveled. Every time he tried to backpedal, every time his explanation became a little too far-fetched, he looked less like the hero and more like a man desperately trying to cover up his own mistakes. The defense attorney didn't let up. She switched tactics, now focusing on the timeline. "Officer Ford, in your report, you mentioned that Ms. Carter's vehicle was parked illegally. However, when you approached the scene, the car was empty. You had no reason to suspect that anyone was even inside the vehicle. Is that correct?" Ford's jaw tightened. The prosecutor's earlier question had clearly hit a nerve. "We approached the vehicle based on routine procedure. We couldn't take any chances." "So, you admit that you had no direct evidence linking Ms. Carter to the vehicle at that point?" Ford shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "No. But we still needed to question her." At that moment, Jasmine could feel a shift in the room. The confidence Ford had carried with him when he entered the courtroom was slipping away. Each word he spoke seemed to weaken his credibility. Jasmine's lawyer pressed on, not giving him any room to breathe. "You also stated that Ms. Carter physically fought back when you tried to arrest her," the defense attorney continued. "Yet, according to your own report, she never made any physical contact with either you or your partner, Officer Harris, until after she was already on the ground, in handcuffs." Ford's face flushed. His earlier statements were coming back to haunt him, and the courtroom was taking notice. Jasmine could see the small beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew the story was starting to fall apart. I was just trying to keep control of the situation, Ford muttered, his voice a little too defensive. Jasmine's lawyer didn't let him off the hook. Control, or power, Officer Ford? Because I believe that's what you were after, not just in this situation but in your broader actions. A woman like Ms. Carter, a woman who knows her rights and isn't afraid to stand up for herself, that's a threat, isn't it? Ford opened his mouth to respond, but Jasmine's lawyer wasn't finished. But that's not the point, is it? The point is, you lied. You fabricated a story. You didn't just misrepresent the facts, you twisted them to suit your agenda. And now, that story is falling apart. Ford's mouth went dry. The courtroom was alive with whispers now. Even the judge's usual composure seemed to waver as he studied the officer, no longer quite so sure about the integrity of his testimony. Officer Lisa Harris, who had been seated at the back of the courtroom, suddenly looked much smaller, her earlier bravado evaporating. Jasmine's lawyer turned to Harris, who was next to take the stand. As Harris rose, Jasmine couldn't help but notice how much more jittery she seemed compared to Ford. Her hands were trembling slightly, her gaze shifting around the room as if she couldn't bear the weight of the accusations now hanging over her head. The defense attorney's voice broke through the tension. Officer Harris, you were present when the alleged confrontation occurred. Can you confirm the details provided by your partner, Officer Ford? Harris hesitated, her eyes darting nervously as she glanced toward Ford for support. But the support wasn't there anymore. Not in the same way it had been at the start of the trial. The officer's nerves were beginning to show, and Jasmine could see that the web of lies Ford had constructed was slowly unweaving, piece by piece. Officer Harris, the defense lawyer pressed, did you witness Ms. Carter making any aggressive moves before you apprehended her? Or was there something else that occurred that night that you haven't shared yet? Harris swallowed hard. She opened her mouth, but her words caught in her throat. She wasn't prepared for this level of scrutiny. She had been trained to answer questions with practiced ease, but the more she tried to defend Ford's story, the more her own inconsistencies surfaced. As the questioning continued, it became clear to everyone in the courtroom that both officers were slipping deeper into a pit of their own making. Their versions of events were now riddled with contradictions. Jasmine's lawyer had laid the foundation, and the walls were slowly crumbling. Jasmine sat in the defense seat, her posture relaxed, every word from the officers only fueling her belief that she was about to reveal something that would change everything. And then, Jasmine realized, it wasn't just the officers who were on trial. It was the system itself. And she was going to expose it, one lie at a time. The reveal. The courtroom was growing increasingly tense as the day wore on. Officer Ford's shaky testimony had already begun to unravel, and Officer Harris was struggling to maintain any semblance of the authority they had both carried with them into the room. Jasmine had watched carefully as the two of them had tried to stick to their version of events, but the lies were becoming more and more apparent. Now, it was time to finish what she had started. The air in the room seemed to hum with anticipation. The trial had already taken an unexpected turn, and Jasmine knew that it was only a matter of time before the entire truth came to light. The officers thought they were clever, that their story would hold up under scrutiny. But what they hadn't realized was that the cards Jasmine was holding weren't just a defense, they were an expose, a revelation that would expose the rot hidden in the very foundation of their actions. The defense attorney, still calm but clearly growing more confident with every word that was spoken, turned to face the judge. Your Honor, the defense calls Ms. Jasmine Carter to the stand. A murmur rippled through the room, and a few heads turned in surprise. It wasn't common for defendants to take the stand in cases like these, especially when their lawyers already had a strong case to present. But Jasmine wasn't just another defendant. She wasn't someone who could be easily overlooked. She rose from her seat, her heels clicking purposefully on the floor as she made her way to the witness box. The room seemed to pause in that moment, Jasmine's every movement deliberate, every step exuding a quiet power that demanded attention. She wasn't just walking to the stand. She was walking to reclaim her narrative, to show the world that she would not be silenced, not by lies, and certainly not by those who thought they could manipulate the truth. She took her seat in the witness box, her briefcase beside her. The soft rustling of papers was the only sound in the room as she adjusted herself. The defense lawyer gave her a small nod of encouragement. Jasmine was ready. She had been ready for this moment for a long time. "Ms. Carter," her lawyer began, her voice steady and controlled, "can you tell us what happened on the night of your arrest?" Jasmine took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice calm but unwavering. "On the night of my arrest, I was sitting in my car, just a few blocks from my apartment. I was parked in a legal spot, and I had my windows down, listening to some music. It was late, but I wasn't doing anything wrong." She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on her. Then, I saw two police officers approach my car. They didn't ask me any questions first. They just started giving me orders to get out of the vehicle, and when I asked them why, they didn't answer. They just repeated the same demands over and over. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew something was wrong. Jasmine continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I complied with their requests at first, but they were aggressive. When I tried to explain that I had done nothing wrong, they told me to shut up. That's when I became scared. I didn't know what was happening, why they were treating me like this. I asked them if I was under arrest, and they didn't answer. Instead, they just grabbed me, pulled me out of the car, and threw me to the ground." She could see the shock on the faces of the people in the courtroom. Some of them had been expecting a different version of events, one that aligned with the officer's narrative. But Jasmine wasn't here to please anyone. She was here to speak her truth, no matter the cost. Jasmine's lawyer stood beside her, ready to ask the next question. "Ms. Carter, did you resist the officers in any way during this encounter?" Jasmine shook her head firmly. "No. I never resisted. I didn't fight back. I was scared, and I tried to reason with them, but they just kept pushing me. I never raised a hand against them." The courtroom was silent as the defense attorney turned back to face the judge. Jasmine could feel the shift in the room. For the first time, the officer's narrative was being called into question, and Jasmine's truth was starting to take center stage. But that was only the beginning. Now, it was time to reveal the most important part of her story, the part that would change everything. "Your Honor," Jasmine's lawyer continued, her voice now tinged with a sense of gravity, "I would like to present evidence that will prove the defendant's version of events. Ms. Carter, would you please show the court the documents you have in your briefcase?" The tension in the room escalated as Jasmine reached for her briefcase. The officers' eyes flickered with confusion, and Jasmine could see the shift in their expressions as they realized something was coming, something they hadn't anticipated. Jasmine opened her briefcase slowly, carefully, and removed a simple manila folder. She held it up for the judge and the courtroom to see, ensuring that every eye was on the evidence she was about to present. "This," she began, her voice steady and filled with purpose, "is the evidence that the officers failed to disclose. Inside this folder is a document that proves who I really am. It's a clearance that most people will never have the chance to see, let alone access. And I'm about to show you all something that will expose the lies these officers have been telling." She slid the folder across the table toward the judge, allowing him to carefully look through the pages inside. The moment the judge flipped the first page, the gasps in the room were almost audible. Jasmine's lawyer remained silent, watching as the judge processed the documents before him. Jasmine had known that this would be the moment that changed everything. The documents inside were no ordinary records. They were classified documents that proved her connection to a higher level of government authority, documents that revealed her as someone with CIA clearance. The kind of clearance that granted her access to secrets few could even imagine, let alone understand. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the judge continued flipping through the pages. The officers, who had been so confident just moments before, now appeared visibly shaken. Their eyes darted nervously around the room. They had thought they could manipulate the system, push their own version of events, but Jasmine's documents were a game-changer. The judge paused, his face unreadable, as he finished reviewing the final page. He looked up at Jasmine, then at her lawyer, and then back at the officers. The moment felt heavy, as if time itself had stopped. Jasmine's lawyer spoke, her voice firm. "Your Honor, as you can see, Ms. Carter is not just an ordinary citizen. She holds a security clearance that places her in a position far above the accusations being made against her." These officers, Officer Ford and Officer Harris, had no idea who they were dealing with. The room was still. It wasn't just a case of one woman fighting back against a lie. It was now a moment of reckoning. The officers had been caught. Not only had they lied, but they had tried to suppress the truth about someone with the kind of influence they could never dream of. The truth was now on the table, and there was no going back. The judge looked over at the officers, who were now staring at each other, their expressions filled with regret and disbelief. The weight of their actions was settling in. Jasmine didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She had already won. The truth was out. And it would not be silenced. Part 4, the aftermath would unfold the consequences of this revelation, but in that moment, Jasmine Carter had already changed everything. The aftermath. The reverberation of Jasmine's revelation seemed to echo throughout the courtroom, rippling into every corner, as if the very walls were trembling from the force of the truth. Officer Ford and Officer Harris, their previous confidence shattered, sat motionless at the defense table, their faces pale as the reality of their situation sunk in. The room, once filled with the hum of murmured conversations, had now fallen into a stunned silence, with the only sound being the soft rustle of papers as the judge perused the documents in front of him. The judge, still holding the clearance papers, looked up from them and glanced at the two officers. Their eyes were no longer the hardened expressions of law enforcement officers who had been in control for so long. Now, they were wide with disbelief and fear, fear of what they knew was coming, and fear of the consequences they hadn't been prepared to face. "Officer Ford," the judge spoke, his voice steady, but the weight of his words seemed to fall like a hammer on the officers, "and Officer Harris, you have been found to have provided false testimony in this court. You have attempted to undermine the integrity of these proceedings. The documents presented by the defendant, Ms. Carter, clearly show that she is not just a civilian. She is a woman of utmost clearance and responsibility. What you've attempted to do here today is not just a matter of misconduct, it's a betrayal of the trust placed in you as law enforcement officers." The officers didn't respond immediately. They were too stunned, too caught in the wave of realization that was crashing down on them. Jasmine could feel the shift in the room, the collective breath being held by everyone present. But she remained calm, her face impassive as the truth she had fought for began to sink into the consciousness of everyone in the courtroom. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. This case will be postponed for further investigation into the actions of both officers. I will also be referring this matter to internal affairs and higher authorities for review. The court will reconvene once those investigations have been concluded. Until then, I am advising both officers to refrain from any further action in this case. Jasmine didn't feel the need to look at the officers anymore. She had already said everything that needed to be said. Her eyes focused only on the judge as he moved toward the next phase of the proceedings. She had fought for this moment, and now, as the court adjourned, she felt a sense of satisfaction deep within her. Her truth had been laid bare, and she had delivered it with precision. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Jasmine's lawyer came over to her, a rare smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You did it," she said quietly, as if unsure if the words could fully capture the enormity of what had just transpired. Jasmine nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead, considering the far-reaching implications of what had just been revealed. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about exposing a much deeper rot, one that could potentially lead to an unraveling of far more than just the lies of two officers. Jasmine had known that, given the right moment, the power she carried could not only save her, but it could change the system itself. Her briefcase felt heavier than ever now, the weight of the information inside it suddenly taking on a new significance. Jasmine knew that the documents she had shown the court weren't just about her security clearance. They were the key to a much larger operation. They were the evidence that could bring to light the corruption that had plagued the system for years, if not decades. And as she stepped out of the courtroom, the realization struck her that the battle was far from over. In the days that followed, the case against Officer Ford and Officer Harris continued to unfold, but now, the investigation had expanded. No longer were they the only ones under scrutiny. Internal Affairs had already begun questioning the officers' conduct, and higher authorities had started asking questions about their past cases. Jasmine's name, once whispered in the shadows, was now on the lips of people who had no idea who she truly was or what she was capable of. Her phone rang constantly, each call another potential lead, another doorway opening to a deeper mystery. She had expected the media to be all over the story, but the media frenzy had been a sight to behold. Headlines were quick to label the officers as corrupt, but what the headlines missed was the bigger picture, the implications of what Jasmine had exposed. She wasn't just a whistleblower. She was a part of a far larger web of secrets, and now the world was beginning to see just how deep the corruption ran. But Jasmine wasn't in this for the fame. She wasn't interested in becoming the face of a movement or the subject of every news story. What she had revealed in that courtroom wasn't about her, it was about the system that had failed to protect those it was supposed to serve. It was about the manipulation of truth, the abuse of power, and the systems that turned a blind eye to it all. Jasmine had known the consequences of bringing her truth to light, but now, as the days turned into weeks, she began to feel the weight of that knowledge more than ever. Her every move was being watched. People in the shadows, people who had once been allies, were now sizing her up. The world she had once moved through in the quiet corridors of intelligence was no longer the same. She was no longer a woman with power behind the scenes. Now, she was a target. The higher-ups, the ones who had once trusted her with their secrets, began to question her motives. Some feared that Jasmine's actions might expose something far more dangerous than two corrupt officers. They feared that her truth might unravel a system that had always operated in the dark. And in the weeks that followed, the calls began coming from unexpected places, from government agencies, from allies who had once been her friends, and even from people she had never met but who knew her name. But Jasmine wasn't afraid. The truth had already been exposed, and now, it was time to take control of the narrative. She knew that there would be no turning back. The life she had built was gone. But she didn't need it anymore. She had a new purpose. And this purpose was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. In the aftermath of the trial, as the dust began to settle, Jasmine found herself on the phone with a few old contacts, people who had once held her in high regard and had the power to help her navigate the labyrinthine world of intelligence and national security. They were cautious, their voices measured, but Jasmine didn't need them to hold her hand. She was done being silent. She had already shown the world the extent of the lies that had plagued her, and now, she would show them what true power looked like. The weeks ahead would be filled with tension, yes. But Jasmine knew that she had struck the first blow. The officers had been caught. But what they had represented was still out there, hidden behind doors that few people had the privilege to open. And she had already opened one of them. In the shadows of government corridors, a storm was brewing. And Jasmine Carter was standing at the center of it, ready to expose it all. The tide turns. The storm that had begun in the courtroom had quickly spread beyond its walls. News outlets were now scrambling to cover the story of Jasmine Carter, a woman with an impeccable, yet hidden, history, who had exposed 2 police officers for lying under oath. What was originally perceived as a simple case of misconduct now looked like a much larger story about corruption within law enforcement. Yet, the media buzz was just the surface. Beneath it, a far more insidious current was swirling, one that threatened to pull Jasmine into deeper waters. Jasmine sat in her apartment late one evening, the city lights twinkling outside her window, casting long shadows in her quiet living room. She had expected a whirlwind in the days following the trial, phone calls, media interviews, people asking questions she had no intention of answering. But what she didn't expect was the profound weight of isolation that came with it. The walls seemed to press in on her more and more, as if the world had grown smaller and she was trapped within it. Her actions had set something in motion that was beyond her control. As the days passed, the fallout from her revelations had reached the upper echelons of the government. People who had once treated her with respect now watched her with a mix of suspicion and fear. Old colleagues in the intelligence community, some who had known her for years, began to distance themselves. The calls from her former contacts were more cautious, their voices wrapped in layers of concern. "You need to be careful, Jasmine," one of them had said on the phone. "You've opened a door that could lead to a whole different world. A world that doesn't forgive or forget." She had understood the warning, but it didn't deter her. The lie had been exposed, but the system that allowed it to thrive was still out there, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and power. Jasmine's role in this wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of her phone. It wasn't a call she was expecting, and the number on the screen wasn't one she recognized. But something about it felt urgent. A part of her hesitated, but the need for answers outweighed her instinct to ignore it. She picked up the phone. "Jasmine Carter?" The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "This is Jasmine," she responded, her voice steady. The man on the other end hesitated for just a moment before continuing. "I'm with the FBI. We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. The FBI? She had no idea what they wanted, but it didn't sound like a casual conversation. "I'm listening," she said, forcing herself to remain composed. "We've been following the aftermath of your case," the voice continued. "And we have reason to believe that the 2 officers you exposed were part of something bigger. Something we've been trying to investigate for a while." Jasmine's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Go on. The officers you implicated, Ford and Harris, they weren't working alone. We've uncovered evidence that suggests they were involved in a larger operation, one that goes far beyond just this case. We believe they've been using their position in the department to cover up illicit activities, including trafficking, money laundering, and a possible connection to organized crime." Jasmine felt the weight of the words settle on her. She had known that there was more to the story than just 2 corrupt officers, but she hadn't realized just how deep it went. The implications were staggering. If Ford and Harris were part of a criminal operation that had been running unchecked, it meant that there were far more dangerous players involved, players who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. "What does this have to do with me?" Jasmine asked, though she already knew the answer. Her role in exposing Ford and Harris had likely opened the door to something much darker. They had just been the tip of the iceberg. "We need your help," the voice said. "You've already shown you're not afraid to take on those who think they're above the law. We need you to help us bring down the people behind this operation." Jasmine was quiet for a moment, considering the request. She had been brought into a world of secrets and shadows, but this was different. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She had become an active participant in a fight that was much bigger than any one case, any one officer. "Why me?" she asked, her voice still calm despite the gravity of the situation. "Why not just go after them directly? We need someone on the inside, someone who can navigate the world they've built," the agent replied. "And right now, you're the only one who has the knowledge and the credibility to do it. You've already exposed part of the operation. Now, we need you to help us take it all down." Jasmine took a deep breath. She had always known that her involvement in this case wouldn't be the end of it. But what they were asking of her was something entirely different. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. This was about becoming a part of the system she had once fought against, an ally to the very people she had always distrusted. "I'll help you," Jasmine finally said, her voice steady. "But I want full immunity for everything that comes with it. I've already risked too much." The agent agreed to her terms without hesitation. "We'll make sure you're protected. But you need to move quickly. Time is running out." The call ended, but the weight of their conversation hung heavily in the air. Jasmine wasn't sure what to feel. On one hand, she had just made a decision that could change the course of her life forever. On the other, she was taking a step into a world she had never imagined for herself. A world where the lines between right and wrong were far more blurred than she had ever realized. The days that followed were filled with a whirlwind of preparation. Jasmine's involvement with the FBI wasn't something she could make public, nor was it something that anyone could know about. The first steps were already in motion. She was given a new identity, new cover stories, and instructions to begin gathering intelligence on the people involved in the operation. Jasmine was now working alongside the very system she had once thought of as corrupt, but she had no illusions about her role. This wasn't about her. This was about dismantling the operation that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. The first assignment came quickly. Jasmine was instructed to meet with a contact she hadn't heard of before, someone deep within the organization she was now tasked with infiltrating. She was told to play the role of a woman with connections to the right people, someone who could be trusted, someone who could start to pry into the secrets that were being hidden. The challenge would be to get close enough to the key players without revealing her true identity, without giving away the fact that she was now working against them. The moment she arrived at the meeting point, a small, dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, she knew things were different. This was no longer a fight for justice. This was a war. A war where allies were few, and trust was a commodity even rarer than the truth. She took a seat at the bar, her back straight, her eyes scanning the room as she waited for her contact to arrive. As the minutes passed, Jasmine's mind raced. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Not now. Not after everything she had already sacrificed. Every move she made from this point forward would be a calculated risk. Every word she spoke, every step she took, would be a potential turning point. She was no longer a defender of the truth. She was a player in a much larger game. And in that game, the stakes were higher than ever. Part 6, Justice Redefined would continue to unravel the complexities of Jasmine's involvement with the FBI, as she walked the fine line between ally and adversary, uncovering dangerous truths and making sacrifices that would change her forever. The battle for justice was no longer just about exposing lies, it was about surviving in a world where the truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. Justice Redefined. The heavy weight of the decision Jasmine had made pressed down on her as the days passed. Each new assignment from the FBI came with its own set of risks, its own uncertainties. But nothing felt as dangerous as what she was now doing. No longer could she stand as a passive observer in the world of corruption and deceit. She had entered the fray, and now every action, every step, had the potential to push her further into the shadows. Or to tear down the walls that had been built to keep the truth buried. The meeting at the bar had been the first of many. Her contact, a man named Roland, had appeared out of nowhere, his identity shrouded in mystery. He was a mid-level operative in the underground network Jasmine was now tasked with infiltrating. He had given her a cryptic warning about the dangers ahead: trust no one. Everyone has their own game to play, and nobody plays it clean. His words had lingered in her mind, the implication clear: Jasmine was now part of a bigger game, one where survival meant knowing when to play by the rules and when to break them. Each day, Jasmine found herself slipping deeper into the world of secrecy, a world she had always loathed, yet was now tied to by invisible strings. The FBI had made it clear that they needed her to get close to the people who had been pulling the strings behind the operation. But the more she learned, the more she realized that this wasn't just about shutting down a criminal enterprise. It was about uncovering the threads that tied that enterprise to a far more powerful network, one that extended beyond the law enforcement world and deep into government circles. Jasmine's first task was simple on the surface: gather intel on a series of financial transactions linked to the operation. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but she knew that every detail mattered. The file she was given contained a list of names, dates, and amounts, all leading to an offshore account. A few clicks of a mouse and she had traced the transaction back to a high-profile political donor, someone with connections in the highest levels of government. The donor's name was never on any official paperwork, but the money was, laundered through shell companies, hidden in plain sight. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat as she realized just how high this went. What had started as a corrupt officer's misconduct had spiraled into a web that reached the very heart of the political system. The implications were staggering. And the more she uncovered, the more dangerous her role became. She spent her nights poring over files, tracking down every lead, every whisper of information she could find. Each conversation she had with Roland, each encounter with the network she was embedded in, was carefully calculated. She had learned quickly that in this world, nothing was ever as it seemed. Allies could turn into enemies with the slightest provocation, and the information she had gathered wasn't always as reliable as it seemed. Trust was a commodity she could no longer afford to give away freely. One night, as she was preparing to meet with Roland again, a message flashed on her phone, a text from an unknown number. Your involvement in this is no longer optional. Your silence is a liability. If you don't stop what you're doing, you will regret it. The message was clear. Someone knew what she was up to. Someone in the operation. Or perhaps someone higher up, was starting to take notice. Jasmine's pulse quickened, and she instantly regretted leaving the phone out in plain sight. She knew what had to be done. She couldn't afford to let fear cloud her judgment. She was too far in, and there was no turning back. She had to keep going. The next day, Roland reached out with new instructions. There was a meeting, one that would bring together several key players in the criminal operation, including the politician whose name had appeared in the financial records. It was a meeting that could give Jasmine access to the entire network, a chance to hear firsthand how deep the corruption ran. But it was also a risk she hadn't taken lightly. The location was set, a private estate on the outskirts of the city, secluded and hidden from the public eye. The instructions were clear: she would go in as someone with influence, someone with connections to the right people. She would act as though she was part of the system, blending in with the high-profile figures who frequented these types of events. But the truth was that Jasmine was there to listen. To learn. To gather the final pieces of the puzzle. As the night of the meeting approached, Jasmine's anxiety grew. She hadn't anticipated how deeply she would be drawn into the undercurrents of this world. She had prepared herself for corruption, for lies. But what she was starting to understand was that this wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing. This was about dismantling an entire structure, a structure built on manipulation, power, and deceit. And the people she was now involved with weren't just criminals. They were experts in controlling narratives, in shaping the truth to suit their needs. When she arrived at the estate, Jasmine took a deep breath and surveyed her surroundings. The sprawling mansion was bathed in soft lighting, its gardens meticulously manicured, the kind of setting that screamed wealth and power. As she walked through the grand hallway, she could feel the eyes on her, each step weighed down by the knowledge that every person in this room was here for a reason, for a purpose. Roland had given her a name, Raymond Darrow, a shadowy figure at the center of the operation. Darrow wasn't known to the public, but his influence stretched far beyond anything anyone in the room could comprehend. He was the true architect of the network, the one who had pulled the strings from behind the scenes, using his connections to launder money, manipulate political campaigns, and cover up anything that got in his way. Jasmine knew that this meeting could be her chance to expose him. But as she walked further into the heart of the gathering, she realized that there was more at stake than just bringing Darrow down. This was about the truth. And the truth was far more elusive than she had ever anticipated. She was led into a private room where the others were already waiting. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Faces she recognized from the political world were seated around a polished wooden table, their expressions cold and calculating. At the head of the table sat Raymond Darrow, a man in his late 50s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through the facade of anyone who crossed his path. He wasn't the kind of man who smiled often. In fact, he didn't seem to smile at all. Jasmine took her seat at the table, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She had practiced her role over and over in her mind, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of the moment. Darrow's eyes flickered over her, his gaze appraising, as if he was sizing her up. "So, you're the one they've sent," Darrow said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I've heard a lot about you, Miss Carter." Jasmine didn't flinch. "I'm here because I can help," she said, her voice steady. "I'm connected. And I know how this game is played." Darrow's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but something far more sinister. "We'll see about that." The meeting began. For the next few hours, Jasmine listened carefully, absorbing every word that was spoken. It was a twisted game of influence and manipulation, talk of money laundering, deals with foreign governments, and the kind of corruption that could shake the foundation of entire nations. The conversation shifted easily from one topic to another, and Jasmine realized just how tightly woven the network was. It was global, it was powerful, and it was untouchable. But what struck her the most was how easily they justified their actions. They spoke of the greater good, of how the system needed to be restructured, and how their actions were merely a necessary evil. Jasmine felt sick to her stomach as she realized that these people saw themselves not as criminals, but as saviors, people above the law, operating in the shadows to maintain order. As the meeting came to a close, Jasmine's mind raced. She had learned more than she could have ever imagined, but she had also seen the depth of the corruption she was now involved in. She had always believed that justice was simple, that right and wrong were clear-cut. But now, she understood that justice wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about navigating a world where the truth was constantly being manipulated. Darrow rose from his seat and approached her, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've done well tonight, Miss Carter. You're more than just a pawn in this game, I'll give you that." Jasmine didn't respond. She knew exactly what he meant. She was no longer just a piece in a larger puzzle. She had become a player. And with that came a new responsibility. The next steps were unclear. Jasmine knew she had a choice to make, whether to continue down this dangerous path or to find a way to take down the entire operation once and for all. But one thing was certain, her understanding of justice had been forever changed. Now, it wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about surviving in a world where truth, power, and influence were all tangled together in ways she could never have imagined. As the night wore on and the meeting came to an end, Jasmine found herself standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure of what the future held. But she knew one thing for certain, the game had changed. And so had she. The battle for justice was no longer just a fight against corruption, it was a fight for her very survival.